Well, let's get started now. So how did we get the Bible, right? This is a topic that to me is really interesting to know how this came about, because we just have it as a book now. And originally it wasn't, of course. Originally it was a set of individual tiny books. And by the way, our word Bible comes from the Greek word biblia, which means little books, right? Little books. And so really what we're dealing with is a collection of books. It was originally not a single volume, but these tiny little books, these small little books that got circulated among the churches. And so at some point, somebody had to decide which one of those are we going to be using. Well, we'll see that there was a historical reason for that happening, but the churches came to think that they needed to all agree on which ones of those little books to use, and so they went through a long process of weeding some out and deciding which ones should be included. The term canon I will use a number of times today. The canon is just a term that scholars use to mean the list of literature that a community uses as its authority, right? So you can talk about the literary canon in universities today. What are the books that the universities think everybody should read these books, right? Everybody should know these. That's their canon. And so the Christian community had a canon, a list of books that they thought everybody should read. And how did that come about? We can trace that process, that long process, at least as far back as the 600s BC, right? And there's a story in the Bible actually about how that process got started, right? And so I didn't know this until I started teaching biblical studies. I had read the Bible multiple times and just read right over this and didn't think about its implications, right? But in the 600s BC, during the time of King Josiah of Judah, there's a story in there about a renovation of the temple. That King Josiah ordered that the temple be renovated. It had not only at the time the things that the Jewish community used, but there were actually pagan images in the temple as well. And this is called Josiah's Reform, where he gets those pagan images out of the temple, tries to purify, if you will, the faith of Israel. And in that renovation, where they're taking all the pagan influences out and they're rebuilding, refurbishing the temple, the story in the Bible says that they found a book, and that the priests began to read this book and got really disturbed, thinking, oh my gosh, we are not following this. This sounds really authoritative, right? And we're not following it. So they took it to Josiah. Right, and Josiah read it, and it says he tore his clothes. He heard this as the voice of God coming through this book, but he said, "How do we know this is authentic?" Right, so they took it to a woman named Huldah, right, and so she was a priestess at the time. There are a number of female priests in the history of Israel, and Huldah is one of them. They take the book to Huldah. Huldah reads it and says, yes, this is authentic. This is what we should be following. Most scholars today think that was an early version of the book of Deuteronomy. Right, so she's dealing with an early copy of the book of Deuteronomy. You'll hear scholars argue about this story, right? When they found the book, did they actually find a book that had been there for a long time and had just been stored away in the temple? Or did they compile the stories that that the priests thought were the authoritative stories? And this is what they find, right, in the book. So scholars are going to argue about what exactly that means. But the point is that they took this to a woman and said, what do you think? Should the community be following this? Is this something that is from God? And Huldah says, yes, it is. And we start on the process of determining what literature should serve that function within the faith. So even within Judaism, the process of compiling scripture starts right there, right in the 600s BC. So it's a very, very long process as we look at how this process moves forward. We can pretty well date several parts of it. I brought along some things to, so what do you call this, realia here? Right, I have to look. This is a copy of the Tanakh, right? It's the Bible of Jewish communities. Now, they use a lot more literature than this, right? But this is a part of what they use, right? The Talmud will have a text from the Tanakh in the center of the page, then a text from the Mishnah related to it around it on the page, and then text from something called the Gemara around that. So you have three different texts in that page. I mean, one small text from the Tanakh, and then the Mishnah text, and then the Gemara text all around that. So you need a pretty huge page for this, right? But this is divided into three sections. One called the prophets, one called the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the only set of books that every community that uses the Bible agrees on their order, right? Is the Torah. And so it starts with the Torah. We can tell roughly when that became considered authoritative within Judaism. You then move on to the prophets, right? It's another collection of material. And then the writings, the Hebrew names of those up there are up there on the screen as well. So you have you end up with a document with 3 sections. So let's look at when each of those became authoritative in Judaism, and then we'll look at the New Testament quickly. By about the 5th century BC, we know that certain communities within Judaism, in fact, most of them, already accepted the 5 books that we just talked about, the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What they used beyond that varied tremendously, depending on which version of what would later be called Judaism the person was practicing. But by about 500 BC, between the area of 400 BC, the 5th century, right? 400 BC to 200 BC, you get this rising consensus that everybody should be reading the Torah, right? So you get up to 200, and there's going to be practically universal agreement on this. Everybody should be reading the Torah. So that takes, again, that process takes several hundred years. Right? And then you get the prophets. By about 200, most forms of Judaism also was reading the books that we call the prophets today. Right? So we can tell that for the vast majority of them, they were reading those books. They considered them to be scripture, a term that we would come up with much later, right? but not everybody. There's a group in the New Testament called the Sadducees that Jesus has a lot of contact with, a lot of conflict with, in fact, that probably at the time of Jesus refused to use anything other than the Torah, right? And so they would be the standout group that like the Pharisees were clearly already using the prophets, but not the Sadducees, right? And so you had different varieties of what we would call Judaism now, right? That didn't agree on which books to be using. And so even at the time of Jesus, this is still a debate. Right? Jesus, surprisingly, maybe to many modern readers, was much more aligned with the Pharisees than with the Sadducees. Right? So he would be reading many of those same books. Let's see. Around the year 100 CE, you notice I've changed the letters from BCE to CE. BCE is before the Common Era, right? The era that starts with early Christianity, right? And now we're into the time after Jesus. By about 100, the Jewish community had agreed on this, right? They had the Torah, the prophets, the writings, and so that would be a settled issue. The Sadducees, by the way, are gone by this time, right? They were the group that Rome used the most to administer the Roman province of Palestine, right? And so when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and really later they came back and massacred most of the population, right? The Sadducees were definitely the group they're very soundly rejected at that point because they had been too aligned with the Romans, right? And so that group is gone by 100 CE, and everybody agrees we should be using the prophets, we should be using the writings. Right, the writings are books like Psalms, Proverbs. They're not Torah, not prophets, right? But everybody agrees by about 100. Did I just pushed the wrong button? Yeah. A parallel thing that happens while they're deciding all that stuff is that over in Egypt, a Greek translation of the Bible shows up. The community in Alexandria in Egypt produces a Greek translation because, frankly, those Jews in Alexandria, they were using Greek a lot more than Hebrew, right? And so they needed a translation that everybody understood. They translated the Hebrew Bible, what would later be called the Tanakh, right, into Greek. But when they did that, they didn't follow the same order of the books, the Torah, prophets, writings, right? They didn't do that, right? They had Torah in the same order as everybody else, but they mixed the prophets and the writings. So they pulled some of those writings, like the book of Psalms, forward, right? And stuck it in the middle of what the rest of the Jewish community was calling the prophets. The order that we have in our Bible today is that order, right? It's the order from that Greek translation called the Septuagint. The word Septuagint, by the way, is just straight up the Latin word for 70. There's this legend that arises around that translation that says there were 70, or in some versions, the legend, 72 scholars who all worked independently and produced a translation. And when they brought them together, they were all identical, right? No scholar takes that seriously, right? That's not the way this book was produced, but it's the legend that arises around it. So in the Greek-speaking world, that Septuagint was very authoritative in the Jewish community. Okay? What Jewish communities use today is the Tanakh with that Torah, prophets, and writings order. But in the ancient world, which order you use depending on where you lived. In Palestine, they were using Torah, prophets, writings. In the Greek-speaking world, they were using this other order, which is the one that Christian Bibles follow, which is not terribly surprising because Christianity, the Christian books, all of the Christian books themselves were written in Greek, not Hebrew, right? So the influence of that Greek-speaking community was much stronger than the community back in Palestine. Well, I already said that. Let's see. So there's some more things. When you see this online, you'll be able to, I'm not exactly saying the words that are on the screen. I think you can read. so I'm kind of summarizing as we go along. Okay? Let's switch to look at what happens for the New Testament very quickly. And then I'm going to stop talking and we can have more discussion about this process. The New Testament is itself a process that took hundreds of years for everybody to agree on. All of the books that are in the New Testament were written by the year 100, but were not accepted by all the churches by that time. That process is going to take a good bit longer, right? Let's see here.
And it happens over and over again, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Catholics go with one. And then
oh, yes. And so we have, and this is the time in which we get those differences. Protestant New Testament, Protestant Bible, Catholic Bible, Orthodox Bible, they have differences, right? The differences that they have, one thing that I skipped to when we were talking about the Septuagint. The Septuagint not only changed the order, it added a bunch of books that weren't there in Hebrew, right? Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles still have in them some of those extra books from the Septuagint that Protestants rejected at the time of the Protestant Reformation, right? Books like Judith, the books of Maccabees, right, are in, if you get a Catholic Bible, those books are in the Old Testament in a Catholic Bible, but not in a Protestant Bible, right? What happened in the Protestant Reformation is the Protestants decided to follow the contents of the Tanakh, right? They said those books are not in the Hebrew Bible. They weren't even there in Hebrew ever, right? They're Greek compositions that were created outside Palestine. They're not a part of the world of Jesus. Jesus would not have used them, right? And they're right about that in that the writers of the New Testament, with only one exception, there's just one exception, that they always quote only texts that are in the Tanakh, never from any of those other books that are in the Septuagint, right? The one exception to that is that in the book of Jude, there's a quote from a book called Enoch, right? Enoch, the book of Enoch is in Septuagint, but it's not in Catholic Bibles or Orthodox Bibles either. So it's one that everybody eventually rejected, right? But there's a quote from it in the book of Jude in the New Testament. That's the only place where any New Testament author quoted a book that was outside the Tanakh, right? And so the Protestants in the Protestant Reformation decided we shouldn't be reading those books, right? Those books that were never present in Hebrew, right? Our Old Testament should be the Hebrew Bible, right? And so the first Protestant translations of the Bible translated from the Hebrew, right? So they translated texts that were from the Hebrew. They translated them using a Latin translation. So you get translation from Hebrew into Latin and then Latin into English, the first English translations, and the first German translations as well. So let's look. Okay, so I got off of the New Testament a little bit. We'll get about the year 90. The first thing that we can say impacts the development of the New Testament canon happened around the year 90. We don't have any idea who did this, right? But suddenly, about the year 90.
A librarian.
What?
A librarian.
A librarian, yes. Probably a librarian. But somebody gathered together, somebody went to the churches that had those letters of Paul, because before about 90, the letter to the Corinthians was at Corinth, right? The letter to the Galatians was in Galatia, right? And so you had these letters that were written to the churches, but nobody had thought to gather them together so that everybody could read them. That happened around the year 90. That suddenly the church at Corinth has a copy of the letter to the Galatians, and a letter to the Philippians, and a letter to, right, the letters to the Thessalonians, right? So we don't know who did that, but suddenly around that time, those other letters start showing up in all the churches. So it's pretty obvious that somebody gathered them together. And by the way, we find in the manuscript evidence, we find manuscripts that are nothing but the letters of Paul. Right. And so it's pretty evident that somebody gathered them together, copied them into a single document, and began to circulate that document to the churches. That happens around the year 90. Right. Let's see. The Gospels, by the year 90, the Gospels were Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at least those were already written, right? There's debate about the Gospel of John, right? It may have been written in the 90s, right? And so it may not have been among those first ones circulating. But when the letters of Paul get circulated, at most, each church would have had one of the Gospels. They might have had Matthew's Gospel, or Mark's, or Luke's, but they probably didn't have them all. Right. And so the gospel, the canonization of the Gospels really comes after the acceptance of Paul's letters as something the churches ought to be reading. And so that seems a little backwards, right? Given our present New Testament is organized Gospels first, then the letters of Paul, then other stuff, right? Then it seems a little backwards to us, but historically, it was the letters of Paul that started the process. Right? You get those circulating, and then soon after that, you get multiple Gospels. You get people writing who obviously have access to multiple Gospels because they're quoting something out of Mark and something out of Luke, right? That something that's not in both of them, right? And so we can tell they've got more than one of them now, right? And so the Gospels begin to show up. There are some books that took a really long time, right? They took we're losing our people in the room because they're going to choir. So I'm not going to go through this evidence part. This is just here so that if you were to look at this later, you can see, how do we know this stuff? But what do you take as the implications of this? Right? Realizing that we didn't have I should say this, sorry. The process for the New Testament takes as much as 500 years. Right? We get a slow process of churches coming to building consensus. There were church councils that happened, but by the time those church councils happened, the vast majority of the decisions had already been made. Right? So you had churches already agreeing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels to read. The letters of Paul should be read. Right? There are a few books that were still in debate, like the book of Jude, the book of Revelation, right? Those took a long time to get accepted by everyone, right? But, and the church councils made rulings on those, but we have evidence of Bibles that were produced after those councils that still don't have some of the books that we call New Testament today, and also have others that we don't have in our New Testament today. So the church councils that voted on these things did not answer it didn't settle the issue, right? What actually settles it is long-term use in the churches. I don't know if you have things that you think that questions that this raises for you, or thoughts that you have about what role should these texts be playing now, given that they were the result of a long process of debate, and there was no point at which a fully developed Bible was just dropped out of heaven to us, right? What does all of this imply to you?
Well, I don't know if you've ever worked on a committee, but I have. And it is interesting to consider that the texts were put together in essence by not one committee, but many committees over very
Yes.
long periods of time. And,
Yes.
you know, I think that it is significant to take that into account when you are looking at the Bible as not only authoritative, but when you're using the word God's holy text, you know, this is the implications are that, you know, you can talk very glibly about God having his hand in the process, but it's a flawed process. I mean,
Yes, it's a process. Yeah, like you said, it's sort of like deciding by committee, right? You're having churches debate with each other over, why are you guys using the book of Jude? We don't use that over here, you know, and so you have those debates going on in the early churches, and it's there have been very few, but even in the last 100 years, there have been people who have proposed that we should still be in this process, right? That the debate should still be going on. And one proposal, for example, in the 20th century, was that the possibility of adding Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail as an appendix to the New Testament.
yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting not only to take into consideration that people are actually offended by this, but
Yes.
it just shows the lack of knowledge of what the process has been and what the process may continue to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, you're right. There were people were just up in arms over that proposal, because they didn't really have any idea of this process. And what do you mean you're going to add something to the Bible? You know, how can you possibly say that? Right? But it was a debate. And by the way, if you've ever read that letter, it's kind of easy to understand why some people would think that, because it really addresses in an incredibly powerful way the issue of race relations in the United States. And it was written during the middle of course, the Civil Rights Movement. As the name says, it's Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and he's writing it to pastors, to the pastors. It's very much like what Paul was doing, right? He's writing letters to these individual churches. Well, that's what Martin Luther King did. He wrote this as a public letter to the pastors of those churches that were opposing the civil rights movement.
Yeah,
so,
but when you look at the timeline and the the last book that would have been entered into what would now be considered the canon. I mean, it is a very, very long period of time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're talking about at least, you know, in the 500s BC. I mean, not BC, CE. The really the 400s is the 5th century CE, and the last copies of the Bible produced that differ from our current New Testament, right, were produced during that century. So really the 400s, not the 500s, the 5th century. Yeah. And they had things in them like the Wisdom of Solomon, for example, which there's a book called The Revelation of Peter, right, that shows up in Codex Alexandrinus, which is a 5th century Greek copy of the Bible, right, well after the councils, right, and yet it shows up with those 2 books in the New Testament, right, and so it shows the debate was still ongoing at that time. Right? But that is a very, very long time ago. That's over 1,500 years ago. Right? So
And centered in the same part of the world. I mean, you know,
yes,
you have to say that regionality comes into the discussion as well.
Absolutely.
The idea that anything produced outside that region might be considered canonical, I think, is also an affront to some people, but I don't know why.
Yeah. Yes, and of course, the criteria that the churches use to try to say which books fit, which ones don't, anything we added today would violate those criteria, because the criteria that they use were, one is it, I'm talking about the New Testament here. The Old Testament, there are different criteria, but for the New Testament, it needed to be connected in some way to one of the apostles, right? And of course, Paul is included in that group. There are texts in the New Testament that we know were not written by the apostles, but they were written in the name of those apostles, right? By their disciples, right? And so no book written in the modern world could make that claim, right? And so it would be, so if we were to add anything now, we would have to say, well, we're opening up the criteria, right? Yeah. So. Any other thoughts on what this history might mean for the church today?
I don't know if Abby and Joy are
Yeah,
listening or they don't have their cameras on, so
yeah, I know. So,
it's hard to know.
well, as we move forward, I think it's perfectly legitimate in any of these classes to reach back and say, oh, when we talked about X, when we talked about theology, that first day with Herman, you know, something came up, and I think that's relevant for what we're doing now. Can we reopen that discussion, right? Because we want this to be, while each of us will bring something to talk about for a while, we want this to be a lot about your questions and what you want us to talk about. So if you, over the course of the week, if you're in preparation for next week, if you think of something that has to do with this process and that you would just like to explore a bit further, it's not too late to ask a question, right? And it's not too late to make an observation. It might not be a question, it may just be something you thought about during the week and you say, we should talk about that, right? And so it's totally, we're totally open to that. We're open to being stop and say, wait a minute, let's go back 2 weeks ago. This is what we were saying. How can we say this now, right? Based on that back then. So if you feel the urge to question anything, we're totally open to having you do that. Would love to hear it. Right? So. I will be updating. I will get the links from Megan, right, to put on the website so that the recordings of these classes can be there. I'll also get I'm working on getting the presentations in a form that I can just link the presentation on the website. So that, like, the information on what the evidence is for this process is in the presentation. I just didn't want us to take class time to look at that. But if you're interested in it, right, how do we know that the letters of Paul circulated around 90, for example, right? What kind of evidence shows us that? Well, there's a section in today's presentation that actually goes into those questions. So
that'd be great. That'd be great.
I will try to get that up on the website by next week. So, if we don't have other discussion, I'll let you go a few minutes early, and I'll get to choir. Right? But I'm delighted to have all of you join us this morning, and I look forward to next week. Next week, Herman will be back with us, and he will be leading the discussion. So I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, have a great
Bye.
day. Bye.